There's no, it's almost like walking into a lecture hall without wearing any pants, right? The canonical college nightmare that you have or something when Zoom just doesn't want to work right. So I'm going to tell myself what I just did, which was to go to berkeley.zoom.us, log in there, and then click on the meeting there. And then that seemed to put me in as the host. So maybe that's how this is all going to work in the future. Okay. So where are we at? Well, we're in an upside down world, aren't we? This was the first page of the New York Times last Friday, and it was remarking on the unemployment insurance claims, the new unemployment insurance claims from Thursday, the previous day. These are actual data. The chart is real, and so it may look to you like the thing was a little bit fudged. The things they saw on Twitter was, whoever came up with the way of putting this in as a graphic should be given an award, and I would have to agree. These are actual data. So during the Great Recession, which is the shaded period back here in 2008 and 2009, the unemployment claims were much, much lower, and it's because we saw everything happening on a normal time scale. And this has been a completely different, absolutely unprecedented in the history of everything, pretty much. And the only thing I guess you could say is that the upside here is that we've managed to move so quickly. So we're fallen into a huge recession so quickly because we are able to all move kind of at once. The big population centers along the coasts, and I understand also, I think Chicago in Illinois and other big cities like that, all kind of managed to do similar things at the same time, which put a whole bunch of restaurant workers out of work. So I I feel kind of silly being, grouchy about taking care of my children and spending a lot of time on things that otherwise I would engage in markets to do, but at least I still have employment, and that's a very challenging thing that many other people are not blessed to have anymore. So this is remarkable. I wanted to share with you an econ term that you may not have heard before, and the word is autarky. And I've been thinking about that a lot because it's usually used when referring to countries that either trade or don't trade with one another. But you could think about this as being relevant for thinking of individuals and families engaging in the economy or not. And this is kind of where we've been at, I think. A whole lot of things that originally we engaged in markets to obtain, suddenly we can't anymore, whether it's a babysitter or preschool or a meal out, somebody cooking for you. You can often still get takeout, I guess. So that's where we are. Another thing I wanted to mention, and this keys in a little bit to a topic that was touched on in the midterm, was there's clearly a big prisoner's dilemma happening here. And I hope that you are not as affected by this as I feel like we are with a family of four. It's ironic that we're talking about the economics of household formation and fertility and all that, because normally you benefit from the economies of scale of living together, not being on your own so much. But at times like this, it seems like it's difficult to even set somebody, one person up to go and actually find toilet paper for 4 bottoms, and it's pretty challenging. We're clearly in a state now where the dike has broken, so to speak. The dam is broken, if you like. The buying of staples that can last has risen rather dramatically, and the problem is that once that happens, everybody's dominant strategy is to go out and do it also. And that's why some of the store shelves are bare. If you walk down the pasta aisle or the canned food aisle or the, heaven forbid, the paper products aisle. So I don't think the Trader Joe's in El Cerrito has had paper products now for about 3 weeks. Maybe they do in the morning. And if anything, if any of you hopefully have had better luck than that, you can usually order something and it might be promised to you. But it's a wild time. And I guess what can I say is that it's an unsettling time. Thinking about the economics of it all might help you. It helps me. And of course, I'm not sure a lot of things really help change anything. But it's nice to distract ourselves with whatever it is. Maybe it's watching a good comedy or something on Netflix. And Thank goodness we actually have things like Netflix now. That's something that we didn't have some years ago. We would have had to go out and rent, I don't know, VHS or DVDs or something like that. Okay, today I wanted to say a few things about the midterm scores just to cement some things. I posted a frequently asked questions to B courses that I hope folks were able to see. And then we'll talk about social science on grades, gender, and majoring, which is a little bit less salient because we're going, as I've said, to pass, not pass for this term. So there is a grade distribution which informs whether you pass or don't pass based on whether the grade is, above or below a C minus, but everybody passed who took the midterm. So it's a little bit less salient, but I wanted to talk about this, the second point, because there's some fantastic research by the great Claudia Golden at Harvard about this issue of the grade signal and what do people do with that sort of thing when they think about what they want to major in. Then we'll talk about the history of US fertility. We'll review some of the income and substitution effects that I bet probably are dazzling and boggling many of you. And if you're like me, they dazzled and boggled me through my undergraduate years, and I don't think I understood them really until I got to graduate school. And so that's what I'm trying to do, is to help at this point solidify some things that are tough, and hopefully we can get through them. Then we'll talk about the Great Recession. We'll look at the TFR, and we'll talk about cohorts and cohort fertility, which is different than the typical way we measure the total fertility rate, the TFR, which is a period measure of how many births per woman are happening based on age-specific rates in a current year, for example. And we'll look at this history of fertility during the Great Recession. Okay, and so I think I've got my Slack channel open, and I'm betting if there's anything crazy, the GSIs will alert me to it, and I'll just go ahead and keep moving us through. So if you've read the announcements, all of UC Berkeley is going to pass, no pass by default, and my suggestion is that you stick with that. I know some students were thinking about strategically trying to take some of their courses for grades and some for pass, not pass. And I understand it's very human to want to do that to elevate one's GPA. I suggest you avoid that for your own mental health. In part, I'm not going to be able to provide a lot of assistance and guidance. That's, of course, what folks might think of is if they're imagining taking C175 for a grade rather than pass, not pass, they'd like to know what the chances are of getting an A or something. And I'm sorry, but I can't spend time trying to advise individual students about that. You're welcome to try, but I suggest that you take a pass on that. Part of the challenge here is that everything has been thrown up in the air in terms of grading and in terms of the pedagogy. And I'm doing my best to teach the course the way I think will help you the best. I'm trying to adjust midstream, and I think you'll agree, just as evidenced by my struggles with Zoom just a few minutes ago, and hopefully will not repeat it again. But I'm trying my hardest, and it's taking a lot of time and energy just to do that. So I'm not going to be able to provide much guidance about the grade, and I suggest that you stick with pass, not pass. Everybody at elite universities is going to be pass, not pass this spring. I don't know of every specific university around the country, but I can tell you that Columbia University of New York was in exactly the same position. Stanford, I think long ago, got the message on that and went for their winter quarter to pass, not pass, and probably has done exactly the same for spring quarter. So you're not going to be alone having pass, not pass on your transcript. I would just stick with it. It's just not worth the headache. So see the frequently asked questions for further details. I apologize, but I'm not going to be responding to individual emails in great detail about this because I just can't spend time on that. I need to spend time on the pedagogy and trying to get my story straight for you guys and trying to help with the learning as best that I can. With that said, here's a sense about what your score means. And so this is the histogram of the score distribution, the probability density function. And the light gray line that you can see there is called a kernel density estimate. And so it takes the actual draws, which you can see are rather jagged, and tries to estimate what kind of smooth distribution behind you might see. There's a pretty long left tail here, so down to the 30s and 40s. Pretty cold, right? If that's for Fahrenheit. Up here is the summertime, and down here is the fall and into the winter. So everybody who took the midterm passes. I'm a little concerned about folks who are down here, and so it is worthwhile looking at your score to assess how you did and to try to assess what you need to do going forward. I also am fully aware that not only is everything like the pedagogy thrown up in the air, but your lives are thrown up in the air too. So I'm normally in a regular semester, I'd be exhorting the folks who are down in this range to redouble their efforts. I wouldn't dream of saying that. If you continue your efforts down in that range, you will pass the course. It would be good if you could try to undertake efforts to improve how you've been doing if you're down in here. But there are so many more things more important than 175 at this point. So, right, I mean, that's just obvious. So that's what the distribution looks like. A, B's, and C's are given by these rough lines here, but again, everybody's on pass, not pass. So I think I'd like to leave that. And again, if there's a fire that needs putting out, maybe the GSIs can flag it for me, or we could discuss offline. So during a more normal term, this really makes me excited to discuss about this point on the next several slides here about how the signal that is in a grade appears to mean something rather different based on the background of the student. And so one cut that you might think is useful to think about here is the gender cut. Another one, of course, might be first generation college students, or another measure of socioeconomic status or something like that. But a big story, of course, over the last forever, a big story over the last many, many years, but certainly in recent times, differences in STEM, demography. It is actually a STEM field: science, technology, engineering, and math. And I guess STEAM is you can put A in there as art, right? So econ is kind of one of those sorts of things. And we're concerned about getting good diversity across gender, across race and ethnicity. And so Claudia Golden had this contribution that I wanted to share with you about the signal that grades sometimes bring. And she talks about in this paper that's hyperlinked in the report that nationwide, you might see something like three male economics majors for every female economics major, and the gap has been widening over time. In 175, we actually benefit from a pretty balanced gender ratio. Of course, one of the big stories at Cal is the race ethnicity balance, which is not what the nation looks like at all. But in terms of the gender split, overall Cal looks fairly balanced, and also 175 looks pretty balanced. But I'm sure I don't have to tell econ majors; they probably know all too well what the balance is like within their major itself. And nationwide, it's rather imbalanced. So why do we care about this? Economics is a great major to have. You typically earn more than other majors, not every major, of course, but it's a really good major to start a career. And the question might be then, well, why do we see these patterns? Why are there fewer econ majors who are female? Are there differences in preferences or aspirations? So that's one of the first stops that Claudia Golden takes. And she says, well, it's possible. More men appear to be likely to enter college with the goal of majoring in economics. And of course, then you might wonder, well, a lot of school and parenting happens before one gets to college, and maybe some of the choke points are there. And I think that's a very valid point, but it's also not an open and shut case that preferences or aspirations really are completely different at the college stage. And also, of course, they're not immutable. I think she would say that too. Differences in math ability would be a complete fallacy, that she looks at this and that the female econ major candidates typically have higher math SAT scores, for example. And so what she looks at is differences in responses to grades. And this is what you might expect to see, that if we graph the probability of majoring in economics along the vertical axis, rather, excuse me, and then a grade signal, say in Econ 1, an early econ class, along the horizontal axis. And so you could code it a different way here, but at 0, we're starting with the highest grade, and then moving to the right, we're getting lower and lower and lower grades. And so that gives you this downward sloping relationship. So you could index it another way, of course, and typically with a grade point average, you'd see this thing reversed, obviously, but this is what she's done. And then you might wonder, well, what do you see if you separate males and females? And the answer is a lot. So here the males are in the dark blue columns with a solid line, a very gently, almost sloping, almost flat line for males here, with a grade signal along the horizontal axis that doesn't seem to change their probability of majoring in econ much. And of course, Claudia Golden is a Harvard economist, and so I think what we're talking about here is the introductory econ course at Harvard, if you want to know. And for females, a very different story emerges, where the light blue columns are the different heaps of female students receiving different final scores in Econ 1. Suggesting that this signal seems, it's the same, right? So the letter grade is the same for, say, the males and females who earn a B- here in this category, but then females that earn a B- in Econ 1 have a much lower probability, like half the probability of actually majoring in economics afterward. So big differences there. So what are we seeing, and what does it mean? Well, at a sort of a bird's eye view, women's major choices are much more sensitive to grades, at least in economics, it appears, and at Harvard. But there are reasons to believe that you would see something similar if you looked at Berkeley, in data at Berkeley, for example. And so you could speculate about what this means. Claudia Golden herself writes here at the end of the first bullet point, guys don't seem to give two damns about their grade. They don't care, they don't mind, and maybe females are different there. Maybe, and this is Catherine Rampel, who's now with the New York Times, I think, but at the time was working for the Washington Post, remarked that male students maybe were more overconfident, the college bros getting gentlemen's C's, or more today, gentlemen's B's, with grade inflation. And perhaps that was unrepresentative of really what was going on. That's what they felt. Or maybe men have eyes on the prize, or something like that. There are a lot of different stories that you could tell here. At the end of the day, there seems to be this big difference in that. And so I think, as somebody engaged in higher education, it's good for me and others to make note of this and talk about it a little bit, that I don't think we intend for the letter to be any different in terms of a signal for different students, but it appears to be absorbed in different ways. Okay, so the bottom line is just as jokes, because again, everybody passes, and this is a very different kind of semester than usual. But the joke is that, ladies, please don't get discouraged by our midterm grades, and gentlemen, please do get discouraged by our midterm grades. But I'm just kidding. Okay, let me take a break and switch over to, I'm hearing the background. Let's see if I can pull this up. What have I got? Oh, I know the problem. If I look at my Slack screen, I think everybody's going to see this. Okay. I think the GSIs are using Slack, and that's fine. So I apologize to everybody. We're still trying to get my sort of workflow here under control. Okay. Having paused, let me just look at the chat and see if there's anything. Yeah, LOL. I think it's great that folks use the chat. I really do. And you can raise my hand if you want to flag me down and stop me, and I'll just keep moving along. And maybe what I need to do is use Slack on my phone. I guess that probably would be smart. So maybe for next time I'll set that up. Okay. I hope none of you folks have muted me. I feel like I'm just sort of rambling right now. It's funny being in a room all by my own and feeling like I'm losing my mind sometimes. So please bear with me, and I apologize for the inconsistency in results here. All right, let's talk about U.S. total fertility and recessions. This chart shows along the horizontal axis different years, dating all the way back to must be about 1933, which I know for mortality is roughly when the vital statistics started to be collected in some systematic way. And so presumably that may also be true for US fertility then. The gray vertical fields here are recessions. And so this is the really big one, the Great Recession. The Great Depression, of course, preceded this, and it's, we probably should have had some shading back here, but the problem is that the vital statistics were not collected particularly well prior to 1933, which was kind of the end. I think the typical dating of the Great Depression was 1929 to 1932 or something like that, and then a very, very lengthy recovery. What can we say about how typical this was? So here's the story, that there was a big reduction in the total fertility rate during this Great Recession. And that's, because as economic demographers, we're interested in this sort of thing. What predicts changing fertility? So that's what this class is about. And it's interesting and fun, and, sort of ties into things that are in the zeitgeist right now. The question, of course, is, what does this current recession that we've been jolted into, what is it going to do to things like fertility, to psychological well-being is what I think about first. But, do people having lost their jobs decide to have more babies or fewer babies? Do people who are under shelter at home, engage in more friskiness? I think that's what my mother called it once, when you get frisky. to folks who are sheltering at home, engage in more of that or less of that or something. And I can tell you that it probably depends on whether or not you have any children currently, because if you do, then there's probably much less friskiness happening. Okay, so we saw this big reduction in fertility and still no rebound that has happened. I don't know why I pronounced it like that. Still no rebound, right? We all talk about it in basketball terms. So the TFR has been below replacement now for some time, and it doesn't seem to show any sign that it's going to be climbing back up. So let me just go back to the previous slide. This horizontal line here was roughly where 2.1, or the replacement level of fertility, is. And we had been there prior to this recession. And actually, there should actually be one right here too, the tech bust. I'm surprised that didn't make it into this chart that I'm pretty sure Professor Goldstein had made. So this is the recession back here that helped elect Bill Clinton. And of course, it was a three-way presidential race in 1992 with Ross Perot running as an independent. But there was a recession that helped create a one-term presidency for George Herbert Walker Bush, the first President Bush back then. So a recession there, another actually recession, it turns out, in here, and then a recession here. And this was the last time that we saw a 2.1 total fertility rate in the United States, although it held roughly constant around those levels, slightly below it. And then a big reduction here that we've not seen any change in. So, and hopefully this will be review. I recognize that because of the disruptions to the class, it may well not be. This is the value of time model of fertility. So along the horizontal axis here are the number of kids that a household would be choosing. So underneath this, we've got a female whose wage shows up here in the slope. So there are a couple of things going on here. There's the wage that the female would face times the time cost per child. That's what little t is. So this is, if you like, the direct opportunity cost of spending time raising children, which is the wage times the per child time cost. And then there's also the quality units times the price of those quality units per child. You could think of those as being things like clothes or basketball shoes for your kids or something, or private schooling. And as I've mentioned before, for many of us, because there is no universal preschool, we pay out of pocket for childcare, for school. It is school. They learn a lot of things in school prior to age 5 or 6 when kids go to kindergarten. So the slope reflects then this total or shadow price of children, and the woman's wage is part of that. So that's the first stop here. If we thought about what's happening to the female worker within this household, so the male worker just works, and that's by assumption. It's not a particularly bad assumption, but of course every household is a little different, and it doesn't have to be the case that even there is a male, for example, or that the male always works, but that's the assumption that we make here. There's some amount of earnings that the male worker brings in, and so this gives the household earnings when the female is maxed out in time, and so they've got NMAX kids, which is dictated by the total amount of time that she has to take care of the children. And then starting from there, there's this backward bending budget constraint that reflects this total shadow price of kids, which of course depends on the wage. So what do we say then about a boom or recession impacting fertility here? If we see an increase in the wage due to a boom, then the budget constraint ought to be pivoting upwards. So this W gets bigger, the whole slope gets larger, and this kind of story then emerges where the thing pivots in a clockwise direction. There's a new optimality point, and the question is, where is it in relation to the old one? This depends on how curved you make these indifference curves. So if they look like L's, you might posit that, here's an L of just with my arrow I'm drawing. Maybe another L might be up here. And when you draw them as very tight L's, what you're positing is that the two goods are complements. They only go together. They're not good substitutes. Here we've got a fairly gently sloping indifference curve, and underneath that then we're assuming that there's some degree of substitutability between these two goods. So the way I've drawn it then would give you a bottom line that looks kind of like this, where there's a pretty hefty substitution effect, as we'll see on the next slide. So there are, generally speaking, income and substitution effects. And again, this is review. It's to set us up for understanding the rest of the slides here about one of the questions is, which of these is bigger, the income and substitution effect? And the reason, as we will see on the next slide, is that in the case of number of kids, we're actually going to be seeing different effects. So let's think about this decomposition. The way that these work is that the substitution effect gets revealed by holding utility constant and trying to find a new hypothetical budget constraint that has the same slope as the new one. So the dashed blue line has the same slope as the new budget constraint. And we're trying to look for a tangency between this hypothetical dashed blue budget constraint and the original indifference curve. And so that reveals the substitution effect. So the teal arrow there moves us in the direction of Seattle to the northwest from where we are. Toward this choice of number of kids that I've labeled N super S there, which is the substitution effect amount of kids that you'd be choosing, except that there also is this income effect as well. So the substitution effect moves us away from kids when this happens. If you like, the opportunity cost of children has risen because the female's wage has risen during this boom. There also, though, is this income effect. And so that moves us from this hypothetical point back to where we actually up. And so it's to be in this direction. I hope I get the sign or the picture right for your perspective here. It's either always in the northeasterly direction toward Maine or in the southwesterly direction toward Vegas, or I guess San Diego might be the good choice there. So the question is, which one of those is bigger? And here, the way I've drawn it, the westward push of that teal line in the substitution effect is strong enough to outweigh the eastward push in the income effect. So the westward push, I need to just choose to do it the wrong way probably. The westward push uh, is bigger than the eastward push of the green line. And so we end up with a net reduction in number of kids here. The income effect is outweighed on the number of kids by the substitution effect. Okay. So I realize I probably raced through that again. Hopefully seeing me talk through it helps. And we'll try to also address this in the optional sections coming up later this week, which I'll talk with. So Katarina is going to lead those, and we'll talk about that later. Those are kind of the big story about the second half of Econ C175 here, which is to try to understand the income and substitution effects and be fluent in them. And here's why this is interesting. The bottom point here is this point that if recessions reduce fertility, then you would say, for example, that the income effect dominates the substitution effect. So in a recession, you would see reductions in wages. And of course, there really are two important things going on here. One is the change in the female wage and also the change in the male wage. The male wage shows up as a pure income effect in this model. It just is changing the height of that kink and moving the budget constraint without shifting the slope at all. So that story is a little more simple. The problem is that when it's a change in the female wage, you get these two dueling effects. And so if recessions reduce fertility, then we could say that the income effect dominates the substitution effect. Meaning that the usual effect of a recession pushing female wages down through the substitution effect, you would say that should increase fertility. Why? Bottom line, maybe it's not that obvious why that would ever happen. It seems kind of crazy to me, I think, on some level. Well, it's because facing a lower wage in the market means that you were losing less by having a child and spending time on the child rather than earning in the market. But there are a ton of reasons why, especially a temporary shock to wages like a recession usually is, ought not to have some kind of lifelong impact. And so we'll come back to that later. So that's why the review here is that this is pointing out that in the parlance, you might say the income effect dominates the substitution effect if recessions ultimately reduce fertility. And this is sort of a good question. So we'd like to know whether what we had seen in the TFR plot, which showed this pretty big reduction in fertility, was that really the economy? And the answer is a strong maybe. There are reasons to think, yeah, and maybe also there are other things going on as well. One of the big problems is that we don't have two different versions of the economy, one that went into a recession and one that did not, and we can't compare them then. Has the income effect always dominated the substitution effect in recessions is another question. And another way of phrasing that is, do we always see fertility rising during booms and falling in recessions, or has the relationship switched? And then another question we'd like to think about here is why hasn't U.S. fertility bounced back to where it was? What does this mean for fertility in the long run? Now, a couple of things. We could look at wages, and Gary Becker famously had plotted these, so they're in the slides from one or two class sessions ago, and you can look at those. The problem with wages, especially over the business cycle, so across booms and recessions, is that you only actually measure wages among those who are actually still working. So they're not really the best measure of conditions across the business cycle, because people stop working when a recession hits and claims their job. Another thing to point out is that the nominal wage, the money wage that you see measured, might be sticky and might not fall like it should. In theory, when a business cycle hits, you should see a reduction in wages to clear the market, and that would offset at least some of the rise in unemployment. And indeed, this is part of the theory that maybe part of the reason why there's unemployment is that wages didn't adjust as much as they should have downward during a recession. So what is much more common is that economists and other social scientists will measure a recession with the unemployment rate. Rather than the wage, the unemployment rate typically measures a recession in a much better way. And the problem with this is that in a recession, of course, unemployment rises and wages fall. So everything gets kind of turned upside down in terms of the signs of things. So if you're like me, that'll be confusing. I get confused all the time about what's rising and what's falling, and what's rising or falling with something else rising or falling. But hopefully we can slowly talk through it and it will become clear. So if we were to look across US states, for example, we find that places with the biggest increases in unemployment and the most housing foreclosures had the biggest drop in fertility. And we also find that where places that had booms, for example, where there was a fracking boom in North Dakota. So fracking is a new form of mining, if you like, that I think primarily produces natural gas, if I remember correctly. It's, it's a way of pulling, petroleum products, I guess, if that broadly can include natural gas and other things like that, out of shale that previously was, something you couldn't actually extract anything out of. So this is a really big deal in North Dakota and other parts of the United States. And there's a very nice paper by Melissa Kearney and a co-author that looks at this question. And it finds that in these places where the fracking boom took hold and there was a big increase in population, incidentally, there also was a fairly substantial rise in fertility. And you could think about that again in this same context of income and substitution effects and how that sort of thing plays out. Here's another study that we'll look at in greater detail, and here Professor Goldstein, whose class this is, then worked with a co-author on this topic of trends in unemployment and fertility in a whole bunch of different advanced countries since the 1970s, which is a similar kind of thought experiment, but it's different than this question of what was happening across US states, especially in response to the fracking petroleum boom, which touched some states but not others. The other thing that, going back to this previous slide, that I apologize for not putting a link in here to Melissa Kearney's paper, which is a very clever one. They also talked about the comparison of the fracking boom to the previous mining booms that were in the 1980s. And if I recall correctly, they find some differences there across time. Then here, when you look at a panel of countries since the 1970s, of course, a lot of the differences are going to be driven by the time period differences. So you'll see differences, say, between Sweden and the United States, if they're in the data set there, but you'll also see big differences within a country across time. And that's here their primary focus. Here are two countries. The left two panels show different time periods for Austria. So the leftmost here is Austria 1957 to 1974. And the relationship then between the unemployment rate, that's always on the horizontal graph, and the TFR, here actually the log of the TFR along the vertical axis. And then in the later period for this same country, the same relationship, the unemployment rate versus the log of the TFR. So an upward sloping relationship here, and then a downward sloping relationship here. So technically too, if you look closely, it's the lagged unemployment rate, which is a sort of reasonable thing to look at there, but it's the lagged indicator of the previous year's unemployment rate and the effect on the current TFR. Of course, with the gestation of 9 months, it sort of makes a lot of sense that you might want to look at the TFR a year later after the big unemployment rate shock. And what they find is that in both these countries, here, of course, you might look at the United States in this earlier period and see not a lot of obvious up or down movement here. Maybe this is just a crazy cloud of nothing, and that's fair. But then in the earlier period, and then in the later period, it does appear that there's a rather strongly downward sloping relationship here. So unemployment rate being higher, lower TFR seems to be the story now, anyway, in advanced countries, whereas it wasn't in earlier periods. Now, if you're like me, having seen the history discussed here, it's not all that surprising that these periods would be so very different. Female labor force participation is very different now than it was prior to 1974. It was much lower then. And we've seen this too in very different responses of female labor force participation with or without small children, where it had previously been very rare for women to be working if they also had small children at home, and that has just completely changed. So that's part of the story here, that it's not so much a deal of relying more exclusively on male earnings in this earlier period. Now, households more typically have earnings from women and from men, and possibly even more earnings from women. And one of the big stories that has emerged over the last decade or so is the falling labor force participation rates, possibly due to disability among men, and sort of a new primal role for female earnings in household well-being. This graph shows the same kind of story in a different way, where here along the horizontal axis is a measure of time. So here's the earliest period, 1957 to 1960, and each one of these ticks off a different set of years, roughly 5 years worth or something. Where now what we're looking at is if you like, a regression coefficient. Here, a semi-elasticity, meaning a sensitivity of the TFR to an unemployment rate. And I apologize for my overlapping words down all here, but what we're saying is that a number like minus 0.6, which is roughly what we're getting, or minus 0.06, means that you have a 1% increase in the unemployment rate reduces TFR by 6%, which is not a huge reduction. We're talking about 2.0 to 1.88 births per woman in a year, but that's different than, certainly, than this earlier period prior to the larger scale entrance of females into the labor force, and a big change in the American family, of course, that we'll talk about more next time. Okay. So why do we see, if you like, income effects dominating? Well, in recessions, earnings of females and males both decline. If only female wages decline, you get dueling income and substitution effects on fertility. And when male and female earnings fall, it's a pretty clear hit to income. I think part's pretty clear. I guess what's not so clear, though, then, is why it seems like we were in this period prior to the 1970s of ambiguity, even the reverse sign. So this is all true. I'm not sure it helps us a ton with the time series that shows up here on the previous slide. I think we're still kind of trying to figure a little bit out about what's going on here exactly. I think this slide has some points that are really very salient here, that for female labor force participation and for childbearing and fertility, it's plausible to imagine that a recession is not going to change something big about one's life course and life trajectory and life planning. And another way of saying that here then is that an opportunity cost is not just foregone wages, but also maybe a career penalty. And the thing is that if it's a bad economy in 1 year, and of course we are all facing this right now, the economy is going to be really bad in the year 2020. And I doubt, and I wish I had constructed a poll here, but I doubt that many of you are going to have children as a result of that. Because these are tough times, and it's likely that we're going to bounce back in some fashion, even if perhaps not all the way back to where we were. And all is not lost. It's not ready. It's not time to throw in the towel, as they say, or it's not ready to ditch one's potential career in favor of having more children. I think that seems right in a broad sense. Now, it also is the case, one I would imagine, that choices do respond to short-term changes. one thing I can think of is that, so parents with children in daycare and preschool, we always form bonds with other parents of children in daycare and preschool. And some of the parents have made pretty, not irreversible, but pretty large changes in their choices as a result of what has happened over the last 3 weeks. And we're pretty sure that one of the parents has decided to withdraw from the labor force. Of course, many of us are having to do that in some way, but for this parent, it seems like it was a little bit more permanent, or at least semi-permanent. And even as I'm saying that, I'm not sure, because it could be something that one could easily reverse, I think, in several months or even a couple of weeks. It is true that once you give up on something like preschool or childcare slots, then actually getting another slot for your child so that you can actually spend time working is actually rather difficult. And that's one issue that we're all grappling with as working parents, is what do we do about the daycares and preschools that are closed, but will they have a spot for our child once they all open up again? Okay, so the next topic then is the timing of fertility across the life cycle. And so demographers call this tempo. And I'm hoping that if I get any of this wrong, that especially Leslie, our excellent GSI, will jump in here and help us with this, because I think she and the other GSIs are more well-versed in demography and tempo discussions about fertility. And in fact, Leslie shows up as one of the co-authors here later in the slides. It's not my area of expertise, and we'll see if I get it right. Okay, so talking about the TFR then, let's talk about how you calculate it and what are the differences between period versus cohort fertility rather. I'm sorry, the TFR is exclusively, I think, period. I don't think we think about, you could I guess say, a cohort total fertility rate is also useful. You might, at that point though, say something like completed cohort fertility, because you don't actually know what it's going to be until the cohort has exited fertile years. Tempo then is this, I'm pretty sure tempo is basically the story about the timing of it all across the life cycle. Okay, the total fertility rate then is this period measure. So in a given calendar year, you want to look at births to women who are aged X divided by the number of women aged X. And that then will give you, summed across all ages, some number like 2, which means that over the course of a life cycle, given the current rates, a woman would have 2 births. But because we're looking at women of very different ages, of course, these particular rates don't really apply necessarily to any one person in particular. And just as sort of a shout out to what we're going to do next after talking about fertility, this is one of the reasons why immigration is so interesting. And for the following reason, when immigrants arrive, first of all, a lot of times the initial immigrant might be male, not exclusively, but that's often the case. And the second thing is that they typically are young. And if we're talking about a female immigrant, often then the childbearing will happen after that immigrant has arrived. And what that typically does then is inflate the measured total fertility attributable to immigrants, and it's because they are arriving in childbearing ages. And so they affect the total fertility because they are at childbearing ages. And if you thought about the total lifetime fertility of an immigrant woman, it might be very similar to that of a native-born woman. It's kind of hard to tell until all the dust is settled, if you like. So we'll return to that as we talk about immigration in a few weeks. For a cohort, suppose we thought about women born in a particular year. The cohort total fertility rate then is the sum of their age-specific fertility rates. And this measures, of course, very well the average number of children ever born for the cohort. But the problem is that you have to actually measure this throughout all of the fertile years. And of course, thankfully, fertile years are ever expanding. They can't or it doesn't appear that they keep expanding infinitely quite as strongly as life expectancy appears to be rising strongly. But science is an amazing thing, and it does increase fertile ages, and has. So the problem, again, is just like with mortality. You have to wait until the end of the fertile years to actually understand what it might have been for the birth cohort. And it's, as a result, we tend to look at the total fertility rate instead. Okay, so the total fertility rate in 2016 then measures the fertility rates for women of a whole bunch of different ages in the year 2016. And we're imagining that women over their lives have these different age-specific fertility rates that are observed today, and it's by no means the same as the actual cohort fertility. So, if people just decide to delay and have a child the next year, and especially if they did it all en masse, sometimes you see that. If, for example, a particular year in a zodiac is viewed as being unlucky, then a lot of times people delay as long as they can. And of course, sometimes people can't delay. But if they delay fertility en masse, then you'll see a big change in the total fertility rate, but maybe not at all. No change possibly in the cohort total fertility. So here's an example showing how different rates of fertility could mean very different things for periods and cohorts depending on what is happening here. And I regret for not putting the sort of box around the table here. It might be a little hard for you to stare at, but what's happening here is that time is indexed along in this row along the columns. So here's times 0, and at age 1 in time 0, the number of children is 4, and then in age 2 in time 0, so these are different cohorts, the age 2 folks, fertility is 1 child. Then in the next period, think about the age 1s becoming age 2s here and having 2 kids, whereas the age 1s have 1 kid. And suppose that sort of trade-off thing happens here each time. What are the period totals, what are the cohort totals, and what is happening to fertility timing? Maybe it's easiest to start at the end and work backwards. If you think about the bottom row here, the age 1 fertility, that is declining, and fertility is being postponed into age 2. What does that do to cohort and period measures of fertility? Well, here's the period totals, if you like, of births. It's the vertical sum here in each of these time periods. And it turns out these numbers are just chosen to happily all equal the number 5. So here's 4 plus 1 across these 2 age groups in time period 0. Here's 3 plus 2 in time period 1, also equal to 5. So the sum of them is always 5 in a period sense. The other funny thing is that the cohort totals then are the sums within these diagonal parallelograms, I guess. I didn't draw them particularly well, but I think that's what they are. And each of these actually sum to 6. So those, in some sense, it's stable, but they are a different number than the TFR. And what is happening is that en masse, all of these different birth cohorts are deciding to move fertility more into age 2 than in age 1. And so that's, of course, in a microcosm, sort of the story with fertility generally. Marriage is delayed, fertility also on average is being delayed toward later ages. So the behavior, the choice of timing fertility over the life cycle will tend to drive a wedge between the period versus the cohort measure. This is just a stylized example just to kind of illustrate that timing matters a lot, and you'll see different period versus cohort measures as a result. Further, the other technical point about the math of all this is that when we're talking about changes in timing, it's actually the rate of change in the timing that matters. So if you like, if the mean age of birth, mean age of the mother at first birth really is what we're talking about here, then it's the partial derivative of that with respect to time that matters. And so when you do what's called tempo adjusting TFR, that it takes that into account. And I'll again have to rely on the GSIs, who I think have seen more of this in their demographic methods than I have, and at least in recent years. I think for me, it's been 25 years or so since I've seen this sort of thing. What we're doing is we're trying to adjust for this issue of the timing, the changing, I'm sorry, I'm completely murdering this. We're adjusting for the rate of change in the timing of births over the life cycle, and taking then a tempo adjusted TFR that pops out after you do this sort of thing. And so that's the point of then of this, of the next picture that we're going to look at here. There is some evidence then that suggests this postponement that we are able to adjust for when the tempo adjustment is performed. So that's answer one. But then answer two is that it does appear to be real. And then that is the fertility being still low a considerable time after the recession. It appears to be a real choice and not just postponement. So one thing you might say, right, is that you postpone births because times are not great. And that seems like a pretty reasonable thing to be doing. The second thing, though, is that it appears perhaps we're actually headed toward smaller family size choices that are permanent over the life cycle, and not just a figment of, or an after effect, basically, of the different timing choices. So this slide then shows the effect of doing the tempo adjustment. And so I guarantee, because I don't particularly understand this all this well, you're not on the hook for understanding exactly how we get to this, and I'll leave it to the GSIs, who I think get this much better than I do. But if you adjust for tempo effects, for timing effects over the life cycle, you see this sort of thing emerge, where the TFR then is, again, this simple, straightforward, very clear, but limited period measure, because it doesn't adjust for this issue of the changing timing over the life cycle. If you do, so again, that's data that we already saw. It's showing this big drop off here. If you adjust for the timing over the life cycle, then you get something that is higher here in the out years. And it also shows a little bit less of a baby bust during this period. So here's the baby boom in the immediate post-war, and then rising to this peak here, I guess, in about 1957 or so. And then a big drop off, a big baby bust, and the tempo adjusted TFR doesn't fall nearly as much. It suggests that, yes, a lot of this was choice ultimately, that you did see a big reduction in births per woman in some smoothed, devoid of timing kind of sense here. But a lot of it also was a timing thing. And thinking about what was happening here, so this is actually, ironically, when I was born, was right about here. It was a very challenging time. The Vietnam War was still going on. The oil shocks were hitting the economy. It was a frightening time. The political assassinations, of course, in 1963 of JFK, but then in 1968 and 67, I want to say, of Martin Luther King and RFK, and there was a lot of political upheaval. And it suggests then that some of this delay was because times were crazy and people wanted to wait. So that's what the tempo adjustment will help you remove them from the series here. It takes out the timing effects of delaying, but then getting maybe back on course. And the topic for the GSIs is whether this method actually accounts for people having earlier than usual in the life cycle. I would imagine it probably does. But anyway, that's a topic for other times, I think. Okay, and then here, so I'm so glad to have seen this slide in here. This is a work by Josh Goldstein and our own Leslie Root, looking at the different trajectories of the age-specific fertility rates in different time periods. That's the horizontal axis. The vertical axis are the age-specific fertility rates, and they are actually on different scales here for all these different groups. And so one has to make sure that one reads it right here, that for these young groups, this is a much lower age-specific fertility rate than, say, for the prime sort of birthing years here and here in the in the Northeast panel and in the Southwest panel, but this is where a lot of the fertility action is between ages 25 to 29 and also 30 to 34. But what we're seeing then, and then across these different ages, is the vicissitudes of this sort of thing, and how the fertility rates are sort of declining over time rather monotonically for all of these younger groups, and they're low and staying lower, getting even lower, and especially so. Here's an 18. This is the blue line. This is a pretty young age to have a child. I guess rather than say too much more, I just want to point out one point here, and that is that in addition to writing about the effect of the fracking boom, Melissa Kearney also has some very fun research about the effect of MTV's I don't know what's it called now. It's called Teen Mom. It was an old show now, I guess, at this point, or Single and Pregnant, 16 and Pregnant, maybe. So I bet the folks in the chat are able to pull this up out of their heads better than I. 16 and Pregnant, right? Yeah, so that's exactly right. Thanks, Leslie. So 16 and Pregnant. And so Melissa Kearney has a very nice paper on that as well, talking about these young age groups and the fertility changes. And what she basically says, I'll keep it brief, or I'll try to, I'm not very good at that. In a nutshell, the idea is that the airing of MTV's 16 and Pregnant appears to have pushed these young people away from being single moms, because they can see what it was like in a real sense. That was, of course, the movement in MTV. Of course, when I was young, MTV actually was music television and had music videos on it, but that all sort of changed. And so in the time period under consideration, it was, I think, in the early aughts, it was airing things like 16 and Pregnant, which showed you really what it was like to be a young single mom. And it wasn't real easy, with a lot of challenges, to put it mildly. So I think I'll leave that at that. I think Leslie probably has more to say, and also more smart things to say than I do about this set of things. The other thing that one can say then is that maybe there is a decline in cohort total fertility. And is that good or bad? You could argue it either way. And of course, I think that to some extent the future is yet to be written. I think Leslie probably has some wisdom more than I have about this, as to how much we actually know at this point. A lot can change, of course, over 5 years, certainly, of fertility, and I am one to tell you that, because that happened to us. A lot changed in our preferences and choices over a very brief period of time. Over longer periods of time, of course, things are a little bit more immutable with lifetime fertility. But there's certainly the suggestion here is that there's some part of this that it has been rather permanent. It's a sad story if what families are reacting to and choosing smaller sizes is a weak economy, and they're not unable to live the dream that they originally had, or if they're constrained in other senses. Maybe though, if we're talking about the teen mom story, maybe it's not such a bad thing, and certainly a lot of the policy interest has been on that end of the age range, thinking about fertility to young moms, and how that's usually a pretty big burden for anybody to bear. And if you're able to postpone it, maybe leading to a smaller family size, maybe that's a very good thing overall. Okay, so some takeaways then, and here today, what are the learning objectives? The learning objectives are to hopefully cement a bit more the income and substitution effects that are so important in talking about changing relative prices of things, whether it's over the business cycle, or I think more compellingly, it's over long periods of time. The long-term rise in wages and what has done to labor force participation and also to fertility choice. That's a learning objective. Also then to think a little bit about the long-term impacts of things like recessions, picking apart the short-term changes in timing that the TFR might pick up versus the more long-run or permanent components of fertility, which to some extent are yet to be written. But the tempo-adjusted fertility rate that we saw in that graph is meant to get us close to that. Finally, then, thinking about the changes in lifetime fertility that appear to have been brought about because of the Great Recession. And obviously the big question that we're all going to be asking and hopefully answering with cool data, and hopefully the story is an optimistic one of good choices under uncertainty and under constraints, is what's going to be happening to fertility in the current situation with the current recession. You know, just as a side note, I mean, I've said this before, and I think we've all discussed it, you know, the great thing that we can all be thankful for with COVID-19 is that it does not appear to impact children. It seems to be an emerging sense that also it doesn't appear to pose a great threat to children in utero either. So mothers who are giving birth, there's not a lot of good things that one can say, but at least one can say a few things like that. That's all I got for today. Are there questions? There's a really good question here in the chat. Cohort and period fertility, the difference there is that the cohort fertility rate is what, say, for example, your fertility would be if you're born in the year 2000 over your whole life cycle. And of course, if you're male, it's a little bit different than if you're female. That's a cohort fertility measure. A period fertility measure is what you measure, say, in the year 2020, how many babies are born to different women, and you can then calculate the fertility rate that implies. Here's another question about to talk about the shadow price of children. So let me quickly pull us back to the slide that shows the slope here. The slope is the shadow price of children. And the slope includes a bunch of different pieces here, and the shadow price includes these different pieces. Probably the most important point is that it includes the female wage. So the shadow price or total price of children is not only the financial costs of children, which are the quality units. Think of these as the schools that you send your kids to, times the price of the schools. It also is this component. It's the female wage foregone times the time cost of the kids. That's the shadow price. It's both of those things combined. You're welcome. Thank you. Any other questions? I should say thank you to everyone for bearing with me during the rocky start to all this. I promise I will try to improve. Any other questions? Any update on the final format? Yes, I addressed that, or tried to, in the B course's announcement about this, that the final exam will likely be 100% multiple choice, computer-based, with time, so a certain amount of time that you can spend on it, and folks with DSP provisions will be able to use their time multiplier, for example. So that's the current plan. Thanks to all of you. Any questions? The slide with the time periods. So I'm thinking probably, was it this one? Yeah, the point of this slide is to reveal that the period measure of fertility would be the sum within the period of the fertility for these two different age groups. So here's a group of women in age 1, and they are having 4 children in time period 0. Here's a group of this other birth cohort, women who are age 2 in time 0. They're having 1 child. And the sum of them then is 5, and that's the total fertility rate for time 0. It's also the same, the sum of these is the same for time period 1. And the point is that the cohort fertility rate is then actually shown on the next slide. It's the sum across time for the different age groups of these cohorts. So here are the youngsters in time 0, they become oldsters in time 1. So their cohort fertility is actually the sum of these two things, 4 and 2. So it's actually different. It's higher, and it's 6 here. It's because of the way in which the births are getting delayed into age 2. You're welcome. Thank you for asking the good question. Any other questions? Does this assume that people only live up to age 2? Yes, it does. Yes, I'm going to type that. I'm realizing too that I should probably make available the chat transcript, and I will try to make sure I do that. Any other questions? Okay, I think we're all set. Thanks so very much for joining. I promise I'll try to work out those bumps. Thank you.